Welcome back to another You Said It podcast. Today is the first of a six-part series that we're doing on savage leadership. And I'm very excited to have an old friend and one of what I consider one of the top leaders in our area, John Mcveigh. I want to thank everybody for listening to last week's podcast with the girls from the Asian Pacific Islanders Club. It has now become the most listened podcast that we've ever done in the 3 years that we've had the podcast. Pretty powerful. I know it was also tough for people maybe to hear a few of the things. I give the girls a tremendous amount of credit. I'm excited that a lot of people have reached out to me and said, what can we do? How can we be better? I'm excited that I'm going to be working with Andy Van Horn and Connor Meehan from the high school, and we're going to try to put some action in to support this club, as well as all the other clubs at the high school that are facing a lot of big issues right now. So again, thank you for listening, and we're going to kick it off with the Savage Leadership Series. So first of all, John, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Absolutely. John, what we like to try to do is have our guests do the bio. It'd be one thing if I just read off the bio of John. And again, folks, I am very lucky. When I first started here, and I was a young person at the time, John was in the 7th grade. So I've seen John grow from a little wiry 7th grader to one of the top-notch leaders and people in our Merrimack Valley. So John, how about a bio to all of our listeners? Who is John Mcveigh?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I was born locally. I was born at Lawrence General Hospital and grew up in the area. I lived most of my life in North Andover here with my parents, who were both worked in the North Andover school system. My dad was a teacher at the high school and a coach, obviously, and my mom was the director of special education at North Andover, and had a great experience growing up. Went to Thompson and Kittredge schools in the middle school and the high school, and ran into so many important mentors. You know, when we're going to talk about leadership today, and I always think about how lucky I was, and how many different leaders and mentors I ran into. And I'm looking across the table at one of them because, like you said, I remember 7th grade and hearing about this thing called Teen Co. and not knowing what it was, and you know, and thinking about how that impacted my life over the years, or going to the Lawrence Boys Club and meeting Steve Kelly and Billy Robertson and that in that environment. So I've always felt incredibly lucky about the places that I grew up. You know, I had a great experience at North Andover High School. It was a place where I knew a lot of people. At one point, my dad was my homeroom teacher and my history teacher and my basketball coach, and had some good friends. But I would say in high school, as I think back on it, I was a pretty good student and a pretty good athlete, but I wasn't always very confident in myself and didn't know. You know, I was trying to figure out where I was, and I felt like as time went on that, you know, I had a chance in college to play basketball at Merrimack College nearby, and had another one of the really important mentors in my life, who was Bert Hamill, who was a huge part of my life, and a great experience there. And then you know, when I left Merrimack, I spent a couple years down at Duke University getting my grad degree, and thought I wanted to be an engineer at the time, and got to spend some time watching great basketball down there, and tried engineering and hated it. And got super lucky to, you know, one of those things that just worked out well, and had an opportunity to get into the classroom. And from the moment I got into the classroom, knew that education was really what I wanted to be doing. And so I worked for a year at Andover High, and in that year I met my wife, who still works at Andover High,
Sure.
And had an offer from Brooks, who was losing their basketball coach, and offered me a job as a science teacher and a basketball coach, and took that. And now 18 years later have worked in a bunch of different roles there. I live there with my family and my wife, who I mentioned, Candace, who's a teacher at Andover High School. We have 2 kids, Jack and Kelly. Jack's 14, Kelly's 12. And feel like I'm like the luckiest guy in the world. I have hit the life lottery. So I'm, you know, and when I think about that, I think that relates to leadership, because one of the fundamental things I think about is gratitude, and I think about how lucky I am and how fortunate I've been, and how many incredible leaders have been in my life that I've learned from and have set me up for success.
Absolutely, and we're going to get into a lot of this because, folks, that 18 years at Brooks, he has held many worn many hats, and we're going to get into a lot of that. So John, when we started to think about doing this Savage Leadership Series, one of the things that I've realized during this year, like no other of the pandemic year, is I think that leadership was a broad term, which I don't know if it was fully defined to people. Yeah, he's a leader, or that person's a leader. And is it title-based, or is it action-based? And one of my things, as I strongly believe, is this pandemic, the year like no other, has really shown us who leaders are and who leaders aren't. When I say the ones that aren't, but it's more of just a title thing. I think people have had to make some sacrifices this year, have made to make some tough decisions, and we've talked offline on a couple of those things also. So when I think of leadership, when I think of John McVeigh, how would you describe your leadership style?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think I'm a big believer that leadership is defined by behaviors. And I think it can be really easy to get caught up in the intangibles or qualities or sort of the words of leadership, which are important, but ultimately can work the opposite way if your words don't line up with your actions. And so I tend to think about behaviors when it comes to leadership. I think like the term servant leadership I love. I believe and hope that I'm a servant leader, but I think if to just say you're a servant leader really doesn't do it. What does that look like? And so maybe I think about relational leadership, and so for me that's about knowing the people that you're with, understanding their stories, understanding how they work, what motivates them, what moves them. Sometimes it's about understanding what makes it harder for someone to do their job, and situational. And this is, I think, something that I've grown to understand. I think maybe when I was young, I was thinking like that leadership, it was sort of a static thing. I think leadership is actually very situational, and,
Sure.
and the best leaders have the ability to assess the situation in the moment and sort of pick from a few different tools that they can use to get through the problem. And if you use that same approach all the time, you're limiting yourself and probably limiting the people you work with, because no one approach is ever going to solve every problem.
True. John, when we start to think of our own leadership style, we have to really look back at what our leadership values are. When you think of John McVeigh's leadership values, what are some of those values?
Yeah, I'll tell you the ones I strive for. I think one of the things about leaders, you have to acknowledge that you can't always be all of these things, right? But the things that matter to me and that I value in other people, certainly honesty and integrity being one of the main ones. Sort of being, kind of doing what we say and saying what we do, sort of thing, and making sure those line up. I think empathy is a huge one, and understanding that generally everybody's got a story that if you hear, you're much more likely to understand the why behind their behaviors, and I think the better we do at listening and understanding that, the more likely we are to be able to move forward. I think vision and sort of having a vision and being excited by a vision is a huge part of being a leader, and knowing that as a leader, your job is to sort of set that vision and celebrate it and share it with everybody that you can. I think curiosity is a big one that maybe more than when I was younger that I've tapped into, and sort of starting from a place of wondering as opposed to being certain of where you are, and then authenticity, and I think that's a huge one, because there's so much information about leadership, and it's great, and I love reading leadership books and listening to leaders, but I think it can be tempting. There's a parallel here with basketball coaching, and there's so much information in basketball coaching right now that you can read everything, but there's a danger of reading too much and like paralyzing yourself, or trying to be everything and everyone and not accomplishing any of it. And I think there's a danger maybe in folks who are reading and trying to emulate someone who doesn't have those same values, who isn't wired the same way, and trying to lead that way, as opposed to starting with what you said, which is, what are your values? How can I be authentic to me, right? And because I think that authenticity, people sniff that out. And the longer you're working, the more that happens. There's more, every time you're involved in a situation, the people you're with are, whether they know it or not, are sort of doing the math. How does this line up? Is this, does this match what I'm expecting of this leader? Does this match what we say we're doing? How do their actions reinforce that, or maybe cut it, and make it maybe seem less valuable? So I think that authenticity piece is huge too, and there's a real requirement for leaders to kind of check themselves on that, and to not try to be somebody or something that they're not, because I think ultimately, if you're trying to impress somebody else or trying to be somebody else, you might win that meeting or you might win that moment, but in the long run, you're probably setting yourself up for failure.
For sure. You bring up a word that I use a lot. As a matter of fact, I have a T-shirt that I walk around town that says, "Be curious."
Yeah.
How does being curious, or curiosity in general, how does that lend to any kind of leadership development?
I'm a huge, this is like, and again, I'm sure this happens over time. I don't know that I thought about it a lot when I was young, but sort of the idea of curiosity over certainty. I think I have found that when I enter situations and ask questions, I learn a lot more, and I enter whatever my role is going to be as a leader is further down the road that we need to get by asking those questions. I think the flip side is when you come in certain about something and when you have preconceived notions, you're just as likely to kind of have somebody move the other way to start, and then you spend so much time trying to either rebuild that bridge or whatever else. And I think so many people just need to be heard, right? I don't know that people always need to agree with the final result, but
Sure.
I know if they don't feel listened to, if they don't feel like they've had a chance to weigh in and share their perspective, it's really hard to get buy-in, And on the flip side, it's hard to get them to understand your why if you're not asking questions. If you come in sort of with your blunt approach and say, this is what we're doing, like get on board, you're going to be fighting resistance the whole way. So I think that idea of being curious and asking people to be curious in return, I think that's
Sure.
part of what I try to do as a leader too, is say, hey, like before you come in and tell me, I'd like you to be curious, right? Because if we can get that sort of culturally in an organization where people sit down and think, like more like, can you help me understand? Or what if we did this? And just and investigate with an open-mindedness and a willingness to consider other perspectives, we're way more likely to get to where we're trying to get with that.
I love that answer. John, obviously we've talked a few times about I've known you since the 7th grade, and as someone who's a human behavior specialist, I love observing people. I observed a young John Mcveigh that, keeping with the theme of curious, I saw you kind of watch leaders, and whether it be your own dad, who was a leader in this town, you mentioned people like Bert Hamill. Can you tell us a little bit of what was some of the mentors that you had, in terms of leadership, but also maybe people that had different leadership models that maybe you took a little bit of piece from each person to develop your own leadership model?
For sure. I mean, I think Coach Hamill's a great place to start because, we had an incredible bond from the time I was, I knew him when I was really young.
Sure.
He started at Merrimack when I was born. My dad stopped coaching at Merrimack, and Bert took his assistant coaching job, and that's sort of how long I've been connected to him. We were very different personalities in terms of, I think, how people would describe us. He was so fiery and so extroverted, and I've become more like that. But especially if you think about me in high school, I was the guy who I stayed back and watched, and more than step up and be a vocal guy. And Bert helped me with that, like with my confidence and watching him and seeing his passion and seeing how that worked. That was a huge part of it. You were a huge part of that. You were as someone who came into this town and didn't know anyone and I don't know. I'd be lying, I think, if I said in 7th grade I was connecting all these dots. But I know as time goes on, you can't help but sort of observe that. And you were someone who, when I was a young kid, was reaching out to everybody, and especially the kids who weren't connecting with adults.
Correct.
Right, and that was a big deal, and I know it mattered. I wasn't necessarily one of those kids, right? And I think I knew that. And you connected with me still. It wasn't like you were saying no to the kids who were, but I knew the kids that were in different groups, and that you were finding ways to get to, and had stayed on my mind. I know, like, whether I'm thinking of you or not, I know at our school one of the questions that I'm always asked is who isn't connected right now, because
Right.
I think connection is such a huge part of a community, and in every community there are people who, for one reason or another, either something that's happened to them or something that they've, sometimes it's a combination of things, their own choices, whatever, that aren't connected. And so I think we have an obligation to do everything we can to sort of build the bridge more than halfway. You were someone who did that. I learned a lot from that. I think about, I mentioned the Boys Club guys,
Sure.
the ultimate servant leaders in my mind, and I remember being at the Boys Club and watching them, whether they were working with kids on their homework or in the gym, or, I remember Steve Kelly serving food, it'd be 95 degrees and he's in his sweatshirt, and he's just, like those guys, they're true service. I think servant leadership sometimes is about words. To me, that's when I think about the action. And then my parents were huge in that. Both of them. And my dad, they're very different from each other. My dad has gotten a lot more attention. He was the coach and a teacher.
Sure.
and a bigger personality.
I think people forget your mother was the director of special ed.
Yeah. My mom's. We joke. There was a paper I wrote in the 9th grade where I put something like, my dad is seemingly the boss of the house, but the true boss of the house is my mom, and
Sure.
and I think I benefited from both of them, and in their approaches, in their approaches with me. I think they balanced each other out well. I think they've always served as an example to me in lots of ways. They're obviously as parents, but also just their example and the way that they worked with other. I got to see them work with me and my sister, but also with others. That was a huge deal. I remember my eyes being opened as I got older when I noticed that the players would come over and talk to my dad. It'd be the summer and something would happen, or they wanted to catch up and they'd have a conversation. And I remember as I got older being like, oh, this is what coaching is. It's not just, when you're little, it's just like you show up in November and you coach the team and you leave. And now I'm seeing
relationships.
These relationships that are happening. And then as I got older, I saw it more and more. And then there were people that I think of my dad and Eric Domack, right, who were not necessarily going to be peas in a pod from the outside, but had this incredible relationship. And Eric and I were really close. And we probably, I don't know that I would have predicted that, based on our on our interests and everything else, but we had a real connection. But I'd watch my dad and Doma and be like, all right, I started to see sort of the value in what you could do, and certainly when I got to college and watching Bert, same kind of thing. He was connecting with all sorts of people, and understanding that, like, as a leader, and maybe this is one, like, you didn't have to treat everyone the same, but you had to connect with them, you had to treat them fairly, and you had to make sure that that you were on the same page. And so, I think about like my basketball team at Merrimack, and Bert would treat Sean Brown one way, and he had a different relationship with me, and a different relationship with Reggie Carter, and a different relationship with Jeff Caron, but it all worked because everyone looked and knew we were getting his best. It was
Right.
just that he was really good at knowing what each person needed.
Absolutely great example. There's a coach that both of us admire a lot. I've found over the pandemic he has gotten into more leadership than I remember him being outspoken about leadership, but I think he's a true leader. That's Bob Walsh,
Yep.
Who's presently working at Providence College, but he's been everywhere, and I kind of hang on a lot of his leadership words. I find him a truth teller. I find him someone that just really makes me think, makes me curious. So he has a quote that I just read today before you came.
I read it.
Okay, so you might be prepared for this.
Yeah.
What does this quote from Bob Walsh mean to you? The most consistently powerful approach you can take as a leader is to model the behavior. And you started to touch on that.
Yeah, I laugh because I read it right before I came here. I every time he posts, I read it. And I've been lucky enough to get to know him a little bit. He's recruited a couple of our guys over the years. We've had a player go play for him up in Maine,
Sure.
and he's one of those people that when I read his stuff, I just find myself nodding and learning, and I can't tell you how many times I've texted him or written him a quick note just saying thanks, like that. We've got things in our locker room. What I read today immediately resonated with me. I keep a coaching card in my pocket with, it has a lot of X's and O's on one side I do one for each game and kind of my thoughts and what I want to do, but the other side is more general thoughts. And one of the big lines that I have is calm is contagious, right? And it goes along with what he was talking about today, which is sort of that if coaches are expecting a behavior out of their team, it's pretty foolish to think they're going to get it if they aren't doing it themselves, right? And so I think as a younger coach, I was someone who wasn't all that calm, and whether it was with referees or with our play, and I was tight and nervous, and I think our teams played like that. And so by sort of reminding myself, calm is contagious, right? If I want my guys to be poised, I better be pretty poised, right? If they see me acting like a maniac, if I don't want my players to focus on the refs, how can I be focused on the refs? And that's that the whole article, is that the power of your example is going to, particularly with kids, I think, who are always watching and are always kind of evaluating and trying to figure out, like, you're asking me to do something that requires some sacrifice and it's hard and it's this, and if I see you doing it, I'm probably a little more likely to do it myself. And if you're not, I'm going to have some questions.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I'm sure you probably bought his recent book that it's a great book. It's a quick read, but I got profound things from it. Let me ask you, what would you say is the mental side of leadership?
Yeah, I think the mental side is probably the thing that when you're young, you overlook the most. and by that I mean that you really need to be thoughtful. And the analogy I use is sort of like my basketball practices, right? Like basketball practice is really important, but the most important thing I do as a coach is the practice planning, right? The time I spend ahead of time thinking about what do we need, getting everything organized. So I'm going to use things, and use that time really well with people and be reflective about that fundamental coaching question, which is like, we got a lot to cover. What are we going to focus on today, and what are we going to accomplish? And I think sometimes leaders can get so busy that they don't do that. They're not stopping. They're not kind of taking a deep breath. They're not assessing and assessing themselves as well as other people, and maybe not reflecting too, because that's the other side of it, right? Like after you do something, are you going to take the time and think? And that's not something I did a lot of. I'm trying to be. It's one of my real intentions right now is to, after something happens, I write it out or think it out, or because I think it's that's how you get better, and that's how you learn, and it's what we are hoping everyone's doing. But I think sometimes leaders can get into a habit of just going from like one problem to the next problem to the next problem without thinking like how is this going? Has this been effective? Like should I, what can I learn from this? What can I change from this? And then maybe secondly on the mental side, that the need to, like, you have to be totally engaged and yet just disconnected enough to not take things personally and to not get too results oriented, in the sense of like sometimes things go wrong, and to not take that all on yourself. I think that it's really, really important to have that mental balance and some stability to ride out what can be really tough waves, because if you're sort of riding that roller coaster, it can be hard to be ready for the next one when you're down. So I think there's a huge mental side to that.
Absolutely. John, I've seen you evolve at Brooks School, and it's funny. I remember when you were working for me during the summer, and I actually think your father was getting terrified that your life goal was to work my summer basketball league. And I do apologize to Mike and Jackie. I thought I had much more expectations of you on that, but I knew how much you loved the basketball and working here in the youth center and our culture. When I saw you wanting to be an engineer, totally fully supported your interest in that. It's like with Steve Bedreau, I also saw something different. I'll be honest with you, I saw a teacher and a coach. And it is interesting how sometimes things come full circle. You have become more of a teacher and a coach. You're also a big-time administrator. You have worn, and I think this is not uncommon in prep schools, you've worn a lot of hats over the years, and I think you said 18 years at Brooks. What have been some of the roles? I know I've joked to you at one point that, Jesus, you're involved with financial aid admissions or whatever. You better be able to get these basketball players in. So what are some of the hats you've worn in a leadership role?
It's a good question. I joke, I even have, I had to recently write my leadership philosophy for some professional stuff I'm doing, and I open it with this scene where I look at my dad. We were at a restaurant, and I told him that I wanted to quit engineering and be a teacher and a coach, and he just dropped his fork and stared at me, mm-hmm. And it wasn't because of anything other than a great parental instinct, which is like, I believe you can do anything and you can be more than me, in a good way. But the truth is, it's how I'm wired. I think that this kind of work is so fulfilling, and I've never ever regretted it. And what's been great about Brooks, and to your point, is that I've been able to explore lots of areas of the school, and yet stay at a school that I love. And so, you're right, people wear lots of hats. My path has been a little different because it's been in a bunch of different areas. And so I guess the whole thing, I started as a full-time science teacher. And so I taught kind of a full section, several sections of science, 4 sections, and coached 2 seasons and helped in the dorm. Our head of school asked me to be involved in our college office, so I eventually became the director of the college office. And I loved the college office because it was sort of a different way of working with kids than I ever had. But a lot of it was coaching. A lot of it was sort of helping them understand the process and understanding themselves, and maybe getting out of thinking thinking that the name of the school was what mattered most, and getting more to sort of what that experience would be like and how that fit them. I did that for 5 years, and then had an opportunity. The basketball thing was starting to go pretty well, and in a conversation with our head of school, who's been, and I should have mentioned him, and we'll talk about him at some point, I think, around mentors, but John Packard, our head, has been an incredible mentor to me. And as we talked, he's always sort of said, what else are you interested in? And he's somebody who had a very similar path. He did a bunch of different jobs, and he did the job I'm in right now, right before he became the head of the school. And so he said, what else are you interested in? And we were talking, and I was talking about how much I liked finding kids that I thought were good fits for Brooks. And he said, well, you should try admissions and financial aid. And so I went to that office for 5 or 6 years and did that, and then had the opportunity to this latest role, which started as the Dean of Faculty role and is now sort of an Associate Head of School title. And the Dean of Faculty, it's a completely different role. It's the first adult-centered job I've had. Everything else was pretty much centered around students. This is much more kind of around who we hire, how do we work with people, how do you help people who need professional development, how do you work with people when it's not going well, how do you put them in position. It's a very people-centered job, and it's a service job for sure, and it's been great. So that's been my path. Along that, I've taught along the way, and I've taught every science class we have. I actually taught for a little while in our math department. I'm actually currently teaching a course in public speaking that I've been doing for a couple of years. I love public speaking. It's something it's sort of just a hobby and a passion that I like, and I do a lot of speaking at Brooks, and so I love working with kids on that. And one of the things I like best is that it finishes with this capstone speech. So it's a senior class, and they kind of give a speech to the Brooks community called around the theme like what I believe, and they can really write it about anything they want. And so I've loved that. I've worked in the dorm the whole time. We live in the dorm, and so that's been a big part of what I do. I've advised students the whole way, and obviously the basketball thing has been, I've been the head coach there all 18 years. So definitely a wide range of things that I've been able to do, and I'm not someone who can do the same thing over and over. I know that about myself, and so I'm incredibly grateful to Brooks for different opportunities that's allowed me enough movement to feel things are new and different, and that I'm learning and I'm trying new things, and yet to be able to stay at the school that I love.
And you're an extremely humble person, but it's clear to me, and it's always been clear to me, from Headmaster Packard and other people, what they've seen in you. And you've had an opportunity to obviously wear a number of different hats, and you're one of the main players there. And obviously this last year, a year like no other, Brooks took on something that I watched from afar with some amazement. So as you know, we pulled some things off last year, being one of the only groups in the state that actually ran successful summer programs during the pandemic, and we've been able to stay open every day since June. But I've watched this whole bubble, what I guess I'll call a bubble aspect that Brooks has kind of done to basically have as somewhat of a normal school year. And again, it wasn't normal, but you guys put this in place. Talk a little bit about the leadership of tackling that from a theoretical standpoint at first to actually putting it in place, so when the kids came back in the fall, that they had somewhat of a Brooks school year. So talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think it's such an interesting, I think at the end of all this, it's such an interesting case study around leadership, around human behavior, around psychology, and it'll be fascinating. I think people will be talking about what happened over this time for a long time.
Without a doubt.
I think you see that, unlike almost everything else, schools tend to be pretty similar in their approaches in general, right? Like things are a little bit different from school to school, but generally speaking, things look similar. This has been completely the opposite. Every school seems to have taken its own approach, right? And I think that's a function of the fact that the first couple decisions you make put you in a direction that then dictate the next couple decisions. And for us, the maybe at the core of what we were trying to decide was we had three groups of people. We had our boarding population that was counting on being able to come to school, but to come to school meant they had to live on our campus.
Right.
We had our day students who were local, right, who had a different set of constraints. They wanted to be able to come to school, but they also needed to be able to leave school and go home, and I think a lot of wanted to do kind of their own thing in the ways they always had. We had a third group of students who weren't allowed to come, and those are mostly international kids, a couple who were health related who literally couldn't come to campus.
Sure.
And so the problem was, how do you serve all three of those populations and do it safely and do it in a way that adults are willing to work at? Because I think that's the final piece of this for us, is that at a 24/7 boarding school, adults have to be involved 24/7. There is no, so you can't have a bubble for the students, but something less for the kids. And so, John Packard was the one really who led the way through that, and by the ultimate decision he made, and he would be the first to say, there was no option that served everyone perfectly well. What I liked is that we didn't let that stop us from trying to serve as many people well as we could, and I think that's been something that has happened in some places where you sort of figure out what you can't do, and you get driven by what you can't do, as opposed to what could we do right now? What's our opportunity? And for us, John's kind of fundamental decision was, we are a boarding school. Like we are, that's what we are. We're a boarding school. 70-something% of the students live on campus, and so we're going to stay true to that identity, and we're going to try to use our identity as a boarding school as an asset in this, as an advantage, right? Because while there's lots of things you can identify that make it hard right now, one opportunity we have is the ability to bring kids in and keep them here, and maybe not have to interact with the outside world. And that's what really got us down that path. And so the second thing was, okay, that's fine for some number of people, but it doesn't work for a couple of the populations we talked about. One, the group that can't come here, and second, the group that may not want to. And so then it was like, okay, we need to have another option. Well, we need to have an option for the kids who can't, because they don't have any other choice, and we don't want to abandon them right now. And so that became sort of we need to offer something online. Right, that some way for them to access their experience here, and it's not going to be the same, but particularly around the educational piece, we need to be able to offer them something. And so then for the third group, it was sort of like, we can give them a choice. We probably can't do the commuting thing, and especially, when I think back to last spring and summer, the idea of people kind of coming in, going out felt like the weak link
Sure.
in what we were going to do. And so the idea was, well, let's tell those folks they can either come here and be in the bubble, or they can go online, and so to do that, now you have like that's all great, that's the theory, and now it's sort of the logistics of that. And so one of the things that we perhaps underestimated was a lot of kids were going to take us up on that. We didn't know, when we sort of came up with that idea, who's going to come. Like it was hard to tell. People were saying, I think I'd want to or not, but when the rubber meets the road and we make you decide, what are you going to do? Well, in our case, a lot of the day students wanted to be there, and I think it was such a great, to me, it's such a good problem. It means that people want to be at your school. The challenge was that I think the first 295 kids said they wanted to come, and we usually have about 240, 245 kids on campus. And so now it was this logistical challenge of, okay, we've made this promise, how do we make sure everyone can be here?
Right.
While at the same time recognizing that it's a tough time to be crowded.
Sure.
Like everybody's trying to de-densify, and so it meant we had to invent some new dorms and come up with some new spaces and kind of explore all our different dorms to see, I'll give you an example. There's a room, my house attaches to a dorm. There's a room in between the two, and it's really our part of our house, but it became a double. Sure. It was enough space, and so there were sort of, a couple people that had to do things like that. It helped that John Packard, who was the head of the school, took in 8 kids into the head of school's house. Wow. Right? And so, when I said about action, and it was a signal to everybody that I'm in this with you, right? Sure. And I assign, or I'm involved in the assigning of dorm parents, and he was like, I don't need a team. I will be on duty every night. I'll work with these kids. And so it's hard to push back too much, I think, about kind of how hard you're working if the head of the school is willing to do that. The final piece of this for us that I think was really hard logistically was that this did play out differently for adults than it did for kids. Mm-hmm. We've seen that in so many school systems around teachers' comfort and going into these spaces. Sure. And so our approach with adults was to say, we have to serve our kids, right? That's the mission of the school, is to serve our kids. We also don't want to put you in situations you're uncomfortable with. And so we sort of presented the plan and then opened the conversation to say, anyone who's not comfortable with this, let's talk. Let's figure out what that means. For some people, there were health conditions. Well, for a health condition, we're not going to put somebody who's got a health condition in this situation. And so we let them teach remotely, and we took some of their responsibilities off. Other people, it was more about discomfort or nervousness, and we had those conversations. But it was really hard. You couldn't come up with a blanket policy for everybody. No. And so we relied on our faculty. And the reason it's worked is the adults who are there. And I'll use not just everybody. From the people who work on our facilities crew, right, who were relentless about preparing spaces and cleaning and getting everything ready, right, to all, across the board, certainly our school teachers, everybody sort of had to adjust and do a little bit more. On the school side, John Packard's big thing was, I want to keep people whole. This is not a time where we want to start reducing salaries. It's not a time where we want to, in any place we can. We don't want to be laying people off, and so the message we're going to send is, if we all do a little more, we can at least still keep trying to do what we've always done. And so I guess all of that said, it's worked in the sense that I think kids have had an in-person experience, right? Yeah. And so if you're measuring it against what it usually is, it's going to fall short of that.
Right.
A huge part of this, though, is what are you measuring against, right? to me, it's what are you measuring against if they didn't have it, right? And so if all these kids were home and isolated, like I think we'd be in a worse place.
Sure.
Sorry.
We use the word the obstacle is the way, and you obviously had an obstacle and you figured out a way to do it. How about your leadership during this? And again, you're pretty humble. I know you were a major player with Headmaster Packard and others to pull this off. But what did you learn about your own leadership during this pandemic?
It's a good question. Yeah, it's a number one. I think to emphasize your point, there are so many people and so many leaders over there. I think John certainly in his role as head, has been at the point of that. But so many people, and I hope if we're doing leadership the way I hope, lots of people are involved and we're distributing that. For me, I'm someone who likes people to feel good. I like resolution, and I think everyone does that, but that's always been, how people are feeling matters a lot to me. That was a challenge because I had to recognize some of this. There were things that people were feeling bad about that had nothing to do with Brooks and everything to do with we're in the middle of a pandemic, right. And there's isolation. There's some really tough. We have a first-year teacher who wasn't able to come to school this year because of health concerns. So she's teaching, but she's never actually been on campus. Right. And so we've got these people who are dealing with lots of stuff. And so for me, some of it was being able to work with people and recognize that that sometimes the best we can do is the best we can do, and to not feel bad that it's not perfect. Some of it as a leader was I love the obstacle is the way as a metaphor, is to recognize that not everyone is going to be able to be wired like that at all times, and that you can't expect that for everybody, but you can sort of organizationally promote it and to try to celebrate the people who are doing that and work with the people who are having a hard time and who are perhaps not in a headspace mentally, physically, emotionally to be able to do that, and to not let that get you down.
I mean, you guys have done an amazing job, and I'm only a small fry on this, but as you know, we have had a almost 50-year history with Brooks School in terms of having Sunday night skating. And I knew we were not going to be able to do that this year because you were basically turning Brooks into a bubble. But to talk a little bit and dealing with Bobby, who I love and has been a great friend of the youth center with this, it wasn't just a no. It was an empathy, like, I know this is tough for you because that we raise money out of that. That's a big thing for us. And there was also some hope. Like she originally said to me, nope, you're not going to be able to do anything, but when the kids go home, there's a possibility. So there was kind of like an open door. And the reality was it didn't make sense, and we canceled the year, and hopefully we'll be back next year if we're in a better place. But one of the things is, and Bobby's another leader at Brooks, in just the way she dealt with, be honest with you, I was the last thing you and Headmaster Packard should have been worried about. But there was that feeling of empathy, and I thought that was a real leadership thing with her by just saying, Rick, we apologize, but this is what we're doing. And it was nothing like I just sat there and said, that's what you got to do and you should do it. You guys have done, as I said, an amazing job, and it is a success because I know we're only in April, and I know you had a time where the kids went home and then they're all back on campus now. But I've heard from some kids. I've heard about because as you know, I'm extremely concerned about the social emotional effect of kids. I'm concerned about the social emotional effects of everybody, but as a kid-centric person, my concern is the effects from this are going to go and going to be measured for 5 years from now, maybe even longer, and we need to do that. And I actually have talked to the kids, and they have said, some of the Brooks kids I've talked about, a couple of day students, but a couple are on campus, and the reality, their attitude is, you made the best of a really bad situation. And I think kudos to everybody over at Brooks. I wish you continued success in the bubble this year. And I'm hoping with vaccinations and stuff, you guys will have, I don't know we're going to be totally back next year, but I think we're going to get close.
We're going to get close for sure. I mean, we have a group of students today going over to get vaccinated.
Right.
Like our 17 and 18-year-olds are doing that. Our adults are in that process. I think what I'd say, I like what you're saying, because I think the empathy piece is so important. Not everyone has been thrilled. Like it's been successful in the sense, like I said, that a bunch of people have had good experiences. We also know that it's been hard. And so, we know our day students were frustrated, right? And I think we had to make some decisions that we knew were like there was no decision where everyone was going to be happy, right? And so you try to make the best. And one of those, when we thought about connection, was at least the day students are someplace where they're with people. Like we had some kids that were really far away and weren't close. And so, and the day students some of them were frustrated, and we had some frustrated parents, but I think we tried to listen, we tried to do better. Our kids who were online early on, our teachers had to learn a whole new way of teaching, and so anyone who was surprised that it wasn't flawless, like, you haven't been in a classroom, you're always messing up. And so what I liked about our teachers' approach is they listened. I liked our students were vocal and active, and we had a group of students that were online who met with teachers and said, this is what we're experiencing and this is what needs to go better. And I was glad that our adults didn't take the approach of like, who are you to tell us? Instead, they listened and they connected, and there were kind of frequent meetings to try to check in. And we had teachers sharing with other teachers, this is what will work, and kind of like, why do this, check in with people, and I think it's gone better. It doesn't mean it has not been without bumps and bruises and really tough moments along the way. But I think someone would have a hard time arguing that people didn't care and that they didn't try. And I think ultimately if that's where this lands, we'll feel pretty good about the effort. And I certainly know I am so proud of the people who work at Brooks, and so because we asked them to not go out. It wasn't just like the kids that were in a bubble. Our adults couldn't have their friends couldn't have kids come over. They couldn't go into the different spaces. We really were asking them not to go out into kind of high risk areas, and not to go into restaurants, and not to as part of this, because once the kids got in and were clean, actually the real danger was that some adult was going to get it and bring it back in. The kids weren't allowed to leave campus, and so it put a lot of strain on everybody. But I think that empathy piece was there, I hope.
Yeah, major kudos to everybody over at Brooks. Job well done, and we're not out of it yet, but you guys are plugging along. Let me switch gears a little bit. John is an extremely successful head basketball coach at Brooks, and when I saw John taking the job, with all fairness, it was not a top-notch basketball job. I remember going to watch them on Saturday afternoons with maybe 3 people in the stands, and the product wasn't that great. John, you have built quite a program over there. The question I have in terms of leadership is, what has John, the coach, been to help John, the administrator, in terms of leadership, and vice versa? What is that administrator, John, how has he helped John, the coach, become better?
Yeah, I mean, the fundamental thing, I believe in teams. I have always believed in teams. I believed in the power of the group and how that works. And so, you're talking about, we were not very good when we started. The benefit I had when I got hired very young and very inexperienced, and I joke with current coaches now, and the prep school basketball thing has exploded, and now everybody who gets a job seems like they've already been a college coach. And I had coached for 1 year at the freshman level for my dad. That was my official coaching experience. Now, I'd done a lot of other things. I'd worked here with you, and I'd coached camps, and obviously I'd played. But in terms of true coaching, that was really all I had, and I don't think I'd ever get the job now. The benefit of that was the expectations were so low, and there was no one cared, and so it was an incredible lab for me to try things that I thought might work without I think it's harder sometimes to take over a program that is really successful and functioning, because the expectations are high, and in my case, I just went in, I met some kids, and we had a great first year, and kind of built it from there. And when people ask me about that, the only thing that I'll say that I think I played a significant role in that, more than the kid, and the kids deserve all the success, but I think I found kids who wanted to be there and loved basketball. And I think on the administrative side, that's still the key, right? That it's about people, that you find the people who are going to bring the core values that you need to your organization, and that are going to work in the ways that you expect them to, right? And then to be able to kind of let them do their thing. That's hard. I struggle with that as a young coach. I wanted to manage everything. You and I talked about this a little bit the other night. Where when you're younger, you want to control every possession. You want to manage everything and tell everyone what to do. And as a coach, I've come far away from that. So I think I entered administration maybe further down that road, because I'd had the opportunity to try some things leadership wise, and to get a feel for kind of how people work together. And so administratively, it's trying to be the same thing. It's to identify. I mean, I have a big role in hiring, and so it's trying to think. Who do you want on the bus, right? That's a classic way of thinking. And how do you build a group of adults at a school who bring lots of different perspective and lived experience and identities, and so that no kids walking into the same adult every time, right? No kids ever only seeing adults who look like themselves, and no kids never seeing an adult who looks like themselves. And how do you get that kind of group to work together and give them enough autonomy to do the job the way they want it, and yet enough consistency that the experienced kids are having. And so I think that the coach in me it's always helped, right? It's not, when I think of the tough conversations I have, there's always a parallel to the coaching conversation. Playing time is one that's on my mind a lot.
Sure.
As an administrator, I'm in a lot of conversations about salary and compensation and responsibilities at the school and who's in what house and all these different things. And I've had a lot of experience over the years talking to kids who all want to play more or all want to score more. And I've learned to not, I think that when I was young, that bothered me. And instead I came to see that as a blessing. Like, wow, how great that we have people on my team that want to play more, right? And how terrible would it be if they were sitting on the bench being like, thank God I'm not in the game right now. I try to do that with things like compensation, with roles, with housing. Like, it's great, they're engaged, they care, right? The worst thing you can see in an organization is apathy. That's when someone doesn't care at all. So even if they're upset at me or if they don't agree, I try to remind myself that it's coming from a place where they're trying to, they want to do something, they care. And so I think that has been a big part of kind of what's translated.
I love that. Let's talk a little bit about your family.
Yep.
Obviously, and I'm privileged to know both your parents real well for a long period of time. But a quick question: how has your family grounded you as a leader?
I mean, I'm the luckiest guy in the world when it comes to my family, and that my family, and I'll start with my parents, right? Sort of unconditional love has always been a thing, and so no matter how I'm feeling or what I'm doing, they've always been there to listen. They've always been there to support. Neither of my parents are someone who necessarily agree with you, to just agree with me, and I needed that. I've needed those conversations sometimes to help me figure out another perspective. Sometimes to just reinforce what I already believe. I think having people around you, and I try to do this in my job. Certainly, I do this on my bench in basketball, of people who are willing to disagree constructively, and or to give you other things to think about is really important. And so my parents have been, have been examples of that and have been resources for that. And it's been nice sometimes to have a group of people around here who aren't connected to Brooks School, right? And so
Sure.
It's sometimes nice to be able to just go talk to my parents and not have to think about Brooks. And my wife is the number one person in this, right? And her perspective is great. She's a teacher who's not an administrator.
Right.
She's great at looking at me as I work on my email and saying, she'll walk by and be like, no one wants to read that.
Right.
And I look at her, I'm like, she's right. I'm being too wordy right now. And that's one of my many faults as a leader, is I can talk too much or write too much or whatever else. And she'll just remind me, like, they don't want to be in the meeting.
Right.
They'd rather have that time to do this. And she's just been a really good reminder on the practical side, but also relationally, right? She's incredibly supportive. A lot of our lives have revolved around my role at Brooks. We live at Brooks because it's where my job is. My schedule is crazy. The Brooks basketball team has become kind of the thing that our family, they traveled every game. My wife, we were on a walk yesterday, and we're both, I've got a Brooks sweatshirt, a Brooks basketball sweatshirt. She's wearing a Brooks basketball t-shirt and a Brooks basketball hat. Like, that's a huge part of kind of who we've been. And so she's been a great resource, that when it is tough, of someone who just helps me take a deep breath, who helps me to kind of remind myself and to trust my instincts. Because I think, like any leader, you sometimes second guess that kind of stuff.
I've gotten to know Candace, and she's a special young woman. I think she is someone that grounds you. I think that she's a truth teller, which is kind of where I want to go next. In terms of, she's also been an amazing support of you, and it is pretty cool to see your family. The Brooks games that I've always gone to, I would always see Candace, the kids, your mom, because Dad was on the bench with you too, and it was a pretty cool, from an outsider standpoint, to see a real family aspect there. So in terms of truth tellers, one of the things that I probably sometimes get judged on is that I'm too much of a truth teller. My attitude on that is I don't make apologies for that. I think people that can't be honest with people, it comes back to bite you in the ass. I'll give an example. As a young basketball coach, I would kind of tell a kid where I really saw him, as opposed to saying, oh, just keep working hard, you'll play next year. And then he didn't play next year, and the kid would look at me and basically say, you lied. So, my attitude has always been to be a truth teller. Where do you stand on just the term truth teller?
I love it. it's one of our fundamental core values on our basketball team is like we're going to be truth tellers. I've got coaches who do that. Mike O'Connor in particular, who's my assistant, is one of the most authentic truth tellers I know. Whether it's me, whether it's our kids, and we frame it as truth telling is love, right? That when you actually care about somebody,
sure,
right? And we use simple examples like the spinach in your teeth thing, right? But all of us have that friend who knows how to tell us there's spinach in our teeth before we go out with the crowd, and there's some people who don't tell you you have spinach in your teeth and you go out and embarrass yourself and they save themselves that. There are other people who wait to point out that you have spinach in your teeth when you're in front of the crowd and embarrass you. And there's a middle ground there where you say, I care about you, and because I care about you, I want to share this with you, right? Because I think by sharing this, I'm going to help you. And that's what I care. I care about your growth. I care about your development. And I want, and I trust our relationship enough to know that I can do that without you wondering where it comes from. But truth telling is really hard if you don't have that trust and the relationship. And I think that goes, that first question you're asking about relationship, I think part of why I'm so driven by the relationship is that's how you can get to that conversation. And without it, it's really hard to get anyone to believe you or to weigh it against somebody who's not, and the opposite of it is what I call kind of fast food feedback, right? Which is it's the bag of Doritos of words. It's like, you're doing great. It feels awesome in the moment, but it doesn't sustain you. And if it's all you're getting, you're in trouble. And so how do you build an organization or a team or whatever that has that sees truth telling as love, as like that's how we care for each other, and there's a way to do it, and a time and a place and a way to make sure that that you have that relationship to be able to do it. But if you don't have that, I don't see how the organization can improve or grow or the person or whatever else. So it's hard in the moment, I think, and it doesn't go well with everybody, and sometimes it can, and as a leader you have to understand that can happen and that you can't control that. But I think in the long run, it's the only way to go as a leader. Yeah, no, very well said. How important is networking and connecting with people in terms of building leadership? Yeah, I mean, I'm fascinated by leaders. You said it. I've spent a lot of my life watching. I think that's, I'm a big believer that I can learn something from everybody. I always, I kind of remind myself of that and think about that. And sometimes you learn what you don't want to do, right? But there's always an opportunity to watch and learn and grow. And so for me, it's how do you get out and put yourself. I also want to be authentic, and I know I keep coming back to that word. I'm not a big fan of the networking to network. Right. I think that feels, I don't know, it feels cheap. There are people when I'm on the other end of it, and when someone, and again, I can't say who, I'm not going to use an example here, but there are people who sometimes I think are reaching out or connecting with me because they just want to be connecting with me, right? And that doesn't sit as well, and I'm not as likely to kind of lean into that versus somebody who authentically, who I can learn from and who wants that kind of that trade-off in return. And so, a good example, Kristen down at Norwood is someone Kristen McDonald, who I've gotten to know a little bit this year. We don't know each other well. We've never actually met each other face to face. It's sort of a pandemic thing, but we ended up on a couple calls, and I was blown away listening to her talk about her team. And we ended up talking, and she got to have a season, we didn't, and so she shared her film, and I watched some games, and we traded some emails, and it was just, I learned a ton. I think she enjoyed the kind of the back and forth too, and I think we both felt like, I know we both talked about hey, at some point we're gonna get to go to actually see one of each other coach at some point, and that stuff fires me up. That's where and I'm a believer that I can get that in a lot of different places. And so that's a basketball example, but more often than not, it's not. It's, I have a really good friend from Duke who's a CEO, and he's very active on Twitter with his leadership, and I've caught him on podcasts, and every once in a while I'll try to pick his brain. I just think there's so many good examples out there, and that and so my networking, I guess, is, it starts with when I get to actually meet somebody. So I wouldn't say I do a lot of kind of intentional reach out to network, but when I do meet somebody, I work pretty hard to keep connected with them and to put myself into position to learn from them.
I love your use of the word authentic, which is a word that both of us use a lot. And the authentic network, and for folks that didn't probably catch a little bit what we're talking about, is I've run what's called the Fireside Chat, which is a basketball networking. And during the pandemic, we actually met every week. And it was on Zoom, and a lot of people have never met each other before. But that to me was authentic network, and it wasn't just Kristen jumping on the call because she wanted to connect with John Mcveigh. It was Kristen wanting to pick John McVeigh's brain on different things, and to me, it's just extremely authentic. And it's been one of the silver linings of the pandemic, right? Which I'm huge on silver linings, but that whole connecting, and I agree with you. Sometimes I don't even like the word networking.
Yeah.
I wish I actually didn't use that in the question, but I think I kind of wanted to get at that. Sometimes networking isn't real, it isn't authentic, but in a lot of ways, I believe I become a better leader by doing some of the things you said, really connecting people that really I think can help me, or maybe I can help them, and vice versa.
And that are different, right? Like I think
different,
that's like
correct.
different is the thing that I now learned to look for most, which is sort of, like who's doing something that is totally different than what I've ever thought, and what can I learn from that, and how can I use that to either change what I'm doing or to reinforce, like, nope, I saw it, I appreciate it, I think you're doing a great job, but it wouldn't work for me. And I think either way you're learning and growing as a leader when you do that.
Absolutely. We could talk forever. We only have time for a few more questions. Oh, no, not at all. Let me ask you a tough one.
Yeah.
I look at you, and John's younger than me, so he's not retiring anytime soon. But when you look at it right now, as you continue to evolve, and one of my things is we need to learn every day. If you stop learning, in my opinion, you die. You got to keep learning. Like, what would you like to be better as a leader as you go into the next chapter of your life?
Yeah, almost everything. I say this a lot, right? Like I think I try to balance. I think I'm a confident person, I'm sort of a quietly confident person, but I also know that I have a lot to do better and a lot to grow from and a lot to, and you're right, I'm not close to retiring, but that question is sort of like, how do you want people to think of you? I don't know, it'll be interesting. Like my leadership journey, the Brooks basketball thing has been amazing, but I'm interested in being ahead of a school, and if I decide to be ahead of a school, that's going to end, and so I think about, what do I want to leave if that happens? And I think it's, I want people to feel like I cared, like that I worked incredibly hard for them, that I served them, that I listened, and so what's next, I think, is trying to do more of that, but maybe in different situations, and so it's how do you apply some of these lessons that I've learned at a smaller scale and apply them in different places than I've ever been before, or how do I take, I think the nice thing about as you get older, you get a little more wisdom, you get more experience. And how do I now get the information flowing in both ways, right? How do I have mentors, and then how do I be a mentor, and who can I serve that way? Who are the people that are young that could use, when I think of all those people that I talked about, like that's one of my goals. I hope someday someone thinks of me the way I mentioned all those people at the beginning of this, who I think, like I think about Coach Hamill, right, and how hard that was when he died, and how often I've got his, like a picture of him on my desk, and how often I think, like, all right, like how can I have the role in someone's life that he had in my life, or he had in some of my teammates' life, right, and I think I'm at a good point in my career to have both of those things going on, like that I can still have there's a lot of people who have been doing this a lot longer, and who I can learn from, and then there's this next generation of leaders who are looking to get in, and how can I support them and empower them and spread, and I guess that's what it is. It feels like a gift, right? Like I feel like I have been the recipient of this amazing gift from all these people, and how do I pass that on to somebody else? I guess that's what's on my mind right now, and in doing that, not in a charity way, but more like in the way I'm describing that. Actually, I think you learn from that, you grow from that. It's not, it's not just sort of a one-way street. And I don't know that I think when I was young, I pictured my mentors sort of just doing it for charity, but I think now I'm starting to feel that that's a lot of fun. It's fun to work with young coaches. I have a blast with that. I have a blast talking to people who are just starting a program. Steve Boudreau, who we've mentioned a couple of times, is a kid I've known since he was in elementary school, and I watch him taking over a team, and and listening to him and talking, that fires me up. And so, I think that's maybe what's on my mind for next, is how do I position myself in the middle of that to kind of to benefit from all of that.
That kind of leads into my last question because, and again, I've said it a few times, and I really need to emphasize this, John is an extremely humble leader. But I follow John on social media, and I've had the pleasure of actually knowing a lot of John's former players. And I see what they look at John, and I'll see the comments they put on social media and how much they respect and thank John. And he has a wonderful former player that I love the day I watched work out in the Brooks gym, and I love that he was more than just a basketball player, and that's Ikenna. He's doing some phenomenal work outside of basketball while continuing to be a phenomenal basketball player. You know, what would you say, I know what you probably said to Ikenna a number of years ago, but what would you say to the future Ikennas in terms of you being a leader to them? And like, what would you say to a young person as Ikenna starts his next life? He could probably use a little advice from you on what it likes to be a leader in your 20s. What would you say to those young leaders?
Yeah, we talk. I love Ikenna Noob. I mean, he's that close to me. We talk a lot. You know, he is at that stage. He's leaving college. He's trying to weigh his decisions. He's probably going to play professionally in Europe, but he's so much more than just a basketball player. He started his own nonprofit in Boston, and it's incredibly successful, and it's around empowering kids. And so, I don't know if Ikenna's the best example because I always feel like I'm learning from him, but I know what you mean, right? Yeah. And I think that there's less of a waiting period than ever before. I think when I was young, and maybe even the generations before that, there weren't as many opportunities to be a leader right away, right? And I think in lots of great ways, technology has changed that. The opportunities that are available for young kids, the platforms that people have, you know, like, and that's. I get excited about that. I think about things like you can, kind of put yourself in a position to get your message out there far earlier than ever before. You don't need necessarily to wait until you're named a coach, right? You can start a program, and Ikenna's a perfect example of that, right? And he started a nonprofit on his own. He was, he graduated college in 3 years, and he was looking for kind of the next thing, and he was still playing college basketball and taking grad study and graduate courses, I should say, and. And all he thought was sort of like, where is there a need? He's an incredible speaker, he's got a gift with words as a writer, and so that's what, so his organization is designed around that. Is he gives middle school and high school kids in Boston a platform. It gives them a chance. It gives them skills to help learn about being speakers, and then he has contests, and he puts them in positions with mentors who can grow. It's a phenomenal program, but it's a perfect example. I don't know that 20 years ago, that you could have just started a nonprofit that way. It was harder, and now it's there. So I guess one of my things I'd say to people in their 20s, just go. Don't wait to be asked. If you see a need, do it, and there are going to be people who are around to help you and guide you, but I think that's what's exciting to me. You don't have to, you're not bound by anything that's happened before. You can start, look for a need, and I think that's when people do reach out and they're trying to figure out what's next, it's sort of like, what whispers to you right now, right? Like what is it that you look around and either wish you had when those people in their 20s, they're still close to, you remember, I know Ikenna remembers what it's like to be in middle school. He remembers what it's like to be in high school. It's kind of like a foggy memory to me right now. I'm not as proximate to that, so if you're going to help young people, what a time to do it, and so I don't know, I would be fired up to be in my 20s right now. I think there's so much opportunity. There's and to do the work and to make a difference. And you've worked with so many young people. And
sure.
I love following them online. I like seeing and I could go down a list of people, and I apologize if I leave people, but I'll read Jimmy Warden's blog, right?
Yeah.
And you get to follow his path. Or Anthony Barry, who's another one of my players who I was texting with yesterday, who's found this passion. I watch him working with kids, right? And I'm just so proud of him. And he's on the kind of on the strength and training and mental approach to athletics. Yeah. And all these kids that I've been lucky enough to work with, right? And I have such joy in that, and watching them kind of go into the world and make a difference. And it's there's just never been a better time, I think, to become a leader than right now. And so if there's one piece of advice, that's it, is to go. I mean,
that hits really home to me because similar to Ikenna is my own son Michael, who
It's funny, and I even as I was driving here, I'm going to say this, right? There is nobody right now who I follow online more and think of around words of authenticity, on making a difference, right? And and it's a good example. Like I've connected with his work because of social media, but
Sure.
that's not a social media organization, right?
No.
Like I think that's a big, and maybe I should have said that before. There's a danger, I think, in thinking like it's all about what you post, right?
Right.
What's powerful about Michael and TMF is the work's being done, and the social media just helps translate it and helps people understand what's going on.
Exactly.
But it's incredible what he's doing, right? And you think about that and what he's been able to do and how young he is, right? And I remember him running around on the court at Drummond, right?
Yeah.
And thinking about the difference he's made, and it's just it's amazing. It's the best. I'm glad you said it, because it's as good a local example. I talk about it with my wife. He is walking that walk that we're talking about right now.
Like him and Ikenna, and they're around the same age. Michael's a little bit older than Ikenna, but you're right. They're really doing it. They're not talking about it. They put it in action. And as a father, obviously extremely proud. And I started this program when I was 26 years old, and it was everybody knows me as Rick Gorman. But the most satisfying thing right now is I'm known as Michael Gorman's father, and there's nothing more special than that, because I know your parents. I mean, Mike McVeigh is known as John McVeigh's father now, not just Mike McVeigh. So I appreciate you saying that. A couple last things. We do a little thing on a one word. So I'm going to throw out a few leaders. And I just want you to kind of, when I throw out this leader's name, and obviously I gave you no prep on this, what's the first thing that comes to mind? It could be a one word. It could be a sentence or whatever. Walt Disney.
Imagination. I think that's a good example of something that didn't exist before, and to imagine the possibility. He's somebody who created something that had never before existed. He wasn't trying to improve something or do his own version. That he did it his own way.
Absolutely. Somebody that you and I like that's now announced his retirement. Roy Williams, University of North Carolina.
Human. I've seen a lot of coaches in practices. He's the most human, high-level Division I basketball coach I've ever seen. I sat and watched the practice, and the whole time thought, I wish my son could play for this man. And watching how he treated people, watching how he treated managers, how it wasn't just about the stars of the team. And I think you've seen that even this week with how he's handled this and how he's supported Hubert as he's taken over. He's such a human leader.
It's funny. Some people will sometimes fight me on how good of a coach he is. And we can have that debate, I guess, but the reality is I don't know if there's anybody that's had such a relationship. I got choked up just listening to his former players' testimonials on Twitter this week. Just amazing. Steve Jobs.
Yeah, I think about him in response to failure, and how, he's, because what Apple has become, people think about kind of his role in that, but he was fired from Apple.
Yeah.
He gives an incredible speech that I listened to in my oratory class, where he talks about kind of how freeing that was for him. It makes me think a little bit about coaching this year, when coaches this year weren't weighed down by having to make tournaments or win the tournament or anything, and he describes when he was fired as the most freeing time. It's when he invented Pixar. It's when he sort of reimagined himself. It's when he found his wife, and his response to that, he had been successful. He was sort of publicly embarrassed and feeling bad, and his response to that was to create more and to jump back in and to, I admire the heck out of that. And the phrase that I always think of with him is that you can't connect the dots looking forward. I think about that with my life all the time, right? That you can't. So many times, and kids do this a lot. They want to try to figure out what's next and what's going to happen after that. And sometimes you have to have faith in like the decisions you make, that it's going to work out. That was my thing with when I left engineering. It's like I didn't have a great plan, but as I look back now, it was the most important thing I ever did.
Sure.
But you can't know that until later, and so you have to have faith in the fact that the dots will connect as long as you sort of stay authentic to yourself and and what you believe.
Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
Yeah, icon, and walked the walk and talked the talk, and was just, I think, right at the very top of leadership in my mind around her own personal example. When you watch how she lived her life in every single aspect, a hero of mine.
Absolutely. Last one, somebody that's a mentor to you, and was a mentor to me, and I'm older than you, but he was a mentor to me. We miss him every single day. Bert Hamill.
Yeah, that one's a tough one. He was so important in my growth and development, and he just cared. He cared so much about kids, and his passion and the way that he cared about his players, maybe more the way he cared about the kids at the club, and what that meant, the way he cared about his family. Like I think that like he was someone who gave his whole heart to the things that he was involved in. He wasn't like he was not looking like he was very focused, right? He wasn't looking. He didn't have a ton of like we used to joke. He didn't have a ton of interest. Like he loved basketball. That's what he wanted to do.
Right.
It wasn't like people would say take a break. He wasn't all that interested in that. But he was such a great father. He was such a great husband. And like what Jill and the kids meant to him, it was, I remember like even as a player watching that and just learning. And then our relationship was something that will always stay with me.
Absolutely, and we miss him every day. John, I want to thank you coming on to be our first in the Savage Leadership Series. This was phenomenal. I think people are going to get an awful lot out of this. A little bit of your story, a little bit of some of your recommendations, learn from a little bit of how you grew and how you continue to grow. But if people don't know John Mcveigh, once we get to a real open world again, go over and see him at Brooks School. He's doing a phenomenal job, and if you like basketball, go check out the Brooks basketball team. They are fun to watch, and obviously a good team, but wonderful leadership from John on that. So
I just want to say thanks. I love coming in. You know what you mean to me, right? And what you've meant to me, and there's a reason I mentioned you at the beginning of this is in sort of your mentorship and growing up, right, and how important that was. And the job was important, but it was watching you and learning from you. Like I said, it has been such a big part of this. So I'm just grateful for that, and I'm grateful for this series. I can't wait to listen to some of the other speakers and to learn and just. I just appreciate being here, so thank you.
Well, I appreciate that, John. And yes, leading in next week, we will have State Representative Christina Minacucci. She will be number 2. And I just found out she used to go to school with John Mcveigh in elementary school, so we'll probably touch on that a little bit. But Christina is doing a phenomenal job in her role as a state rep. She is a close friend of the Youth Center. She's been working with me side by side. We put on the vaccination clinic here for our older residents in town, and going to touch on her leadership styles and some of the things. So once again, thank you, John. And as we finish every podcast, we always say too much passion is never enough passion.